So I want to start just first of all by asking you if you're willing to share a little bit about your upbringing and your experience as a Jewish college student when you went to college in the US. What was that like?
Yeah, I went to college at Yale, graduated in 1998, and in the mid 90s, there was really very, very little overt anti-Semitism, and felt, very comfortable on campus. Was never an issue, didn't feel like an issue, um, and for most of my life, that is, I think, how I would assess anti-Semitism. I mean, I know it. We know it exists. Traditionally, it has existed more on sort of the neo-Nazi far right fringe, um, and we've seen anti-Semitism rear its head, and especially for those who are visibly Jewish with wearing, a hat or a yarmulke or in other ways where they receive more of it. But it just wasn't an issue for me when I was a college student and for most of my life.
You've been obviously very outspoken about these issues. What is it that motivates you personally to speak out, and how do you navigate some of the pushback that you've been getting for speaking out against anti-Semitism and being a proud American Jew?
Well, I got into public service initially because, well, for a variety of reasons, but I studied the Jewish involvement in the civil rights movement when I was in college. And that's what I wrote my senior thesis on, and really learned about the great work that Jews did on the front lines of the civil rights movement. And Jews have really been at the forefront of every social justice and equal rights movement. And certainly, yes, back in the 50s and 60s in the civil rights movement, but as it related to the Muslim ban and Trump 1.0 and then anti-Asian hate, the ADL stood up almost an entire parallel organization within the Asian community to fight anti-Asian hate, to use the methods and the lessons that the ADL has learned for the Asian community. And so part of the reason why I've been so vocal is that I have been motivated by a united cause of fighting discrimination against all protected groups, including Jews, and that there's a shared sense of discrimination or prejudice or persecution in the history of a number of protected groups that gave rise to the Civil Rights Act in the mid 60s. And I felt very frustrated to be abandoned by many that I felt like were our allies, and that somehow what was clear anti-Semitism was whitewashed in some ways, as to say, no, no, it's not actually anti-Semitism. And so it was really important for me, as somebody who has been so focused on the united cause of civil rights and equal justice, that I call it out, and that I explained and used my understanding of anti-Semitism and Jewish history and Israel's history to say, and I continue to say, that this is not progressive to hate. And yes, of course, you can protest foreign policy, you can protest Israel's military operation. I disagree with you, but that doesn't mean you can't do it. But you can't go over the line and start attacking Jews and Jewish students in particular for whatever Israel is doing or whatever the United States government is doing. And that is quintessential anti-Semitism that I think a lot of people don't understand. And so I felt like, as an elected official, it was really important for me to call that out and to explain what anti-Semitism is. And I've gotten pushback. I've gotten a lot of pushback from the extreme fringes. I don't even know if they're part of the Democratic Party or not. But it's hard to figure out the ideology here. it's just extremism. It's not progressivism. And my office has been vandalized 3 times. I've been confronted and accosted, and it's for me, it's okay. That's part of the job if that's what happens. But um, it only strengthens my resolve, and it only reinforces to me how important it is to stand strong and to stand up for Jews and against anti-Semitism and against hate. And that as a leader in elected office, that the idea is if I don't do it, then who is going to do it? This is part of the responsibility I have, and I take it very seriously.
Well, on behalf of Jewish students across the country, thank you for standing up and for having so much courage because your resolve strengthens our resolve. Going back to what you were just mentioning about, your what you wrote your thesis on in college about building coalitions, about Jewish involvement in the civil rights movement, the cornerstone of the Jewish community in America is our involvement in social justice movements and civil rights movements, among the many things that we have contributed to this country. But I'm curious, what advice you have for Jewish students like myself in America today that want to build those coalitions but are struggling to do so?
I'm grateful that you and others like you are continuing the tradition of social justice engagement by the Jewish community. And as frustrating as it is right now, as difficult as it is just to have these conversations, and it shouldn't be as difficult as it is. It's even more important in my mind for us to continue to do that outreach and to do that engagement and to try to figure out ways of doing that. I would like to be able to say, well, screw you, we're going to do it ourselves, but we're a very small group of people. Um, and we can't really do it ourselves, and we shouldn't have to do it ourselves. Similar to how we've come to the defense of many other groups when they've been treated wrongly, we should have support elsewhere. And so I spend a lot of time talking to colleagues and others in different communities about our shared experiences and why this is not progressive to hate Jews, to call Jews Zionists, to tell Jews to go back to Poland, to call for violence against Jews. That's not progressive values. That's hate. And I know it's been especially difficult for you at Columbia. I went up um, to Morningside Heights. I guess it was the Monday morning after the Saturday night when there was all that upheaval and disruption and some violence on campus. And it was actually the same day that Speaker Mike Johnson went to Columbia. He went to the steps of the library for a big press conference to call for the firing of the president. I went to the Kraft Hillel Center to talk to Jewish students, and 3 of my Democratic Jewish colleagues were there with me. And we took a tour of campus. We saw the encampments, and it was just really important for us to show up for the students, not for the media or for any political gain, because you all have borne the brunt of this, and the strength and the poise and the perseverance that Jewish students all around the country have shown, I will say, is inspiring to me. It really is. And as I think about having to navigate this, I sit there seeing 20-year-olds who are standing up for doing what the right thing is and say to myself, well, if they can do it, we all need to be doing it. And so you all inspire us. And I spent a lot of time after that working with the university to disband the encampment, explaining to the board members, to others, why this was not okay. And you can't just say, well, it could get worse if we actually enforce our rules. And ultimately prompted them to give the warning about leaving the encampment, and that prompted them to storm Hamilton Hall, and the rest of the story. But I think Columbia has been ground zero for this, and it's been very difficult to watch.
I was just going to say before you mentioned it that you, along with a few of your colleagues, were some of the first elected leaders in the country to come and show up and be there with Jewish students and hear about our experiences. And to us, that just makes the world of a difference because, of course, you're working hard on Capitol Hill to create policy and affect change there, but to also show up and hear about what we've been experiencing and see it with your own eyes really did make a difference to us and made us feel seen when we've experienced just endless gaslighting from administrators who have failed us, from faculty members, and from classmates and former friends of ours who, like you said, are masking this hate-filled movement as one of social justice when we know that that's actually the antithesis of what this movement on campuses like Columbia has become. I want to ask you, we've spoken a little bit about campuses, but what concrete steps is Congress taking and are you taking on Capitol Hill to protect Jewish students on campuses today?
Well, I dove in very quickly to this issue, and my approach was to put the students first and put the students at the center of it. What is the best way to support the students, to address these issues, and to do it as quickly as possible? And it's a very imperfect way to do it, through the federal government in some ways. Title VI of the Civil Rights Act forbids discrimination on campus against any group, and that includes anti-Semitism and includes Jewish students. So I introduced legislation pretty soon after October 7th, and all of the anti-Semitism started escalating on campus, called the Showing Up for Students Act, which would have put more funding into the Office of Civil Rights, which is the government agency that enforces Title VI. And the advantage of doing it this way is that there are tried and true processes and procedures for addressing all sorts of discrimination. The Office of Civil Rights is woefully underfunded, and there were more than 150 investigations into anti-Semitism that were initiated after October 7th, but there was no increased funding and there was no way to actually do all of them. And so I introduced a bill that would have doubled the funding for that office, knowing that this is the way the federal government can swiftly and aggressively address this issue. And it didn't get any support from Republicans in the last Congress. We are about to reintroduce it again while adding some more enforcement power for that office. But everything is up in the air because under President Trump's plan, the Department of Education would essentially be disbanded, and that office would be disbanded, and all of this anti-Semitism work would be moved to the Department of Justice. Now, the Department of Justice always has had some role, but it's a tangential role. It's sort of a support role or role of last resort. And litigation takes a very long time. And my concern is if you move all of the anti-Semitism work to the Department of Justice, you're actually going to make it a lot harder because you're not as nimble with litigation. And so not going to be able to do as many investigations and to do things as quickly or to address the root cause of the problem. And that's really what I think needs to be done. I think the faculties on campuses around the country are a real source of the problem. And I think the curriculum in various different classes and different schools are a big part of the problem. That is something that has to holistically be addressed.
On that note, very much a hot topic right now, but I'm curious what your thoughts are on having federal funding withheld from universities who fail to enforce anti-discrimination policies in line with Title VI. How else can we ensure accountability for universities like Columbia, like Harvard, like UCLA that have unfortunately been sort of perpetually in violation of, in many instances, um, anti-discrimination policies.
Yeah, I think Colombia is an example of up until very recently seemingly doing everything wrong. It's not, it shouldn't be very difficult, and certainly other universities have done this to enforce your own rules. Um, there are different rules on campuses than there are off campuses because Title VI requires students to feel safe and secure in getting access to the education, which means that First Amendment protected speech that would be fine outside of the borders of campus may not be okay in the within the fences of the campus. And so universities are responsible for making sure students feel safe. And Columbia has pretty much fallen down on that job since day one. And then when threatened with withholding $400 million of funding, it was like all of a sudden, well, we can do all the things that we said we couldn't do in order to address anti-Semitism. And so the bottom line is that Colombia, if you use that as an example, is one that would support the sort of over aggressive, excessive overreach that I think this administration is using to tackle this problem. And then what it begets is a new situation at Harvard where you have a bully who found some success by threatening Columbia and says, "All right, well, let's keep going. We're going to do this more and more," and then escalates it against Harvard with more money and with far more demands that have nothing to do with anti-Semitism. And so now it's pretty clear that, at least in some ways, this administration is using anti-Semitism as a pretext to tackle other issues that they want to focus on, which is bad for Jews, is bad for stomping out anti-Semitism. And so while on the one hand, I think, I've heard from students, and curious what you think, but I've heard from students that, well, it's nice that someone is trying to stand up for us. And I understand that sentiment. But we also have to be careful about what it is that the administration is doing in the name of anti-Semitism. And certainly what is happening at Harvard is far, far over the line. And I think in the long run is bad for the Jewish community.
The idea of not being able to thoroughly combat anti-Semitism while upholding the values of free speech and academic freedom have become really central to the conversation on a lot of campuses. Personally, I find that ridiculous. I think the notion that you can't defend academic freedom and Jewish students at the same time is absolutely false. The two are not mutually exclusive, but I'm curious what you think and how universities should try to navigate balancing academic freedom with the need to prevent hate speech, and incitement on campus, because in unfortunately many instances, what begins as hate speech often turns into conduct. It leads to Jewish students being barred from entering parts of campus, and in many cases on Columbia's campus, being even physically assaulted. So, what advice would you have for universities that are trying to balance that struggle?
Well, you hit the nail on the head. It's one thing to have academic freedom and to be discussing different perspectives of history or different perspectives of what the current conflict is, or something that is related to learning and education and intellectual development and academic um, interest. It's entirely something different to have people encamped on campus, which is a violation of the rules, screaming at Jewish students or preventing them from going somewhere, or even harassing them, intimidating them. And harassment and intimidation is often speech, right? It's not that it has to be I don't have to pull a knife or a gun to intimidate you. I can intimidate and harass by using speech. And it may be what is considered protected political speech outside, but when you have a requirement for universities to ensure that students feel safe and they are being harassed and intimidated, then it's not okay. And it shouldn't be that hard to draw that line between opposing foreign policy in Israel and calling for the murder of Jews. Like, I don't, I just am not at all sympathetic to the argument that it's a very fine line. I don't think it is. I think when you see people on New York subways saying, are there any Zionists on this train? Zionists get off. I mean, it's clear Zionist is the equivalent for Jew, and that it has become, whether it was before October 7th or not, there's no question that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism now. And the universities need to listen to the Jewish community. I am tired. I don't know about you, but I'm very tired of being lectured by non-Jews about what anti-Semitism is in with any other group. If I were to start talking to the black community and say, oh, no, 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 that's not racist, that's not racist, I would be vilified, and rightly so. But here I get told all the time what is anti-Semitic and what isn't, which I find very frustrating as well.
Absolutely. I mean, in that regard, I think it can be very helpful to have a standardized definition of what anti-Semitism is. Unfortunately, many campuses, including my own, are not willing to adopt particular definitions of anti-Semitism. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on whether or not we should have a standardized federal definition of campus or of anti-Semitism for campus enforcement purposes, or if that should be subject to individual universities, and how we should go about defining anti-Semitism at the federal level.
My view of this, frankly, is I think it would be helpful for sure, but I don't think our problem right now is figuring out where the line of anti-Semitism is. There is certainly enough conduct, enough speech, enough actions and activities that go way beyond any line of anti-Semitism. Um, and the IRA definition is the definition that the federal government uses by executive order that Donald Trump put into place and President Biden kept in place. So, of all the ways and all the things that we need to do, I support the IRA definition to the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, which includes the IRA definition. I do not think it is a First Amendment violation. And I think it would be helpful to codify that, but that's not my biggest concern right now.
What advice would you give to college students today who might be afraid to speak up for fear of social or academic backlash? Like you said, your office has been vandalized. You've been attacked for speaking up as a proud Jew and for speaking up against anti-Semitism. How do we inspire that same courage in the next generation of Jewish leaders, many of whom are currently on college campuses?
Well, look, as we know from our history, Jews have had to stand up and persevere far too often and far too many times. But it is incumbent within our culture, our religion, our history for us to make sure that we stand up for ourselves. And oftentimes that's all we've ever had is ourselves. And it's the oldest conspiracy theory. It manifests itself in all sorts of different ways at different times for convenience, and often during, anti-democratic periods of history. And we ought to be very careful of losing those democratic values, which have always benefited Jews. And I think that's very important. The the upshot and the way I try to do it is I try to engage wherever I can. I find a lot of times people who have different views than me are not interested in an actual give and take, are not interested in what I have to say. And I don't think you can force it, but I also think that it is important to do your best to stand up for what is right. And Jews have always tried to stand up for what is right. That's our history of social justice. And now is no different. And I think one of the things I worry about is that there is some degree of guilt within the Jewish community because what is going on in Gaza is horrible. It's absolutely horrible. But, and you may disagree, I disagree with a lot of what Prime Minister Netanyahu has done and is doing. But the Prime Minister of Israel is not Israel, just like the President of the United States is not the country of the United States. And it's important to keep that divide. And so what I try to do is I try to identify a couple of sort of unassailable things that are very basic, are very clear, and are pretty much indisputable. And when given the opportunity, I go back to those things. And I think um, I think it's really important to recognize, and I always say that this is about Hamas, this is not about the Palestinian people, and that I actually desperately want Palestinians to have their own self-determination. Hamas is the reason they don't, and Hamas is the reason why Israel is not secure. So we ought to all unify against the terrorist group Hamas so that both groups can have a more peaceful, secure, and prosperous future.
Congressman Dan Goldman, thank you so much for your time on behalf of the Our Campus United family, the Chronicle, and Jewish students across America. We appreciate your time, your wisdom, and your courage.
Well, thank you, Eden, and thank you and all of your fellow students for standing up for what's right. I know history will ultimately judge people on where they stood for right and wrong, and it's a very difficult time now, especially on campuses. And we down in Washington and around the country as Jews are grateful for all the work and the strength that you and your fellow students have shown.